All right, friends, it's a pleasure being here on the Yarzheit of Rabbi Steinsaltz. And in his honor, my dear friend Tal Keinan and I are about to study one short story from the Talmud. The exact source is the Tractate of Brachot 3a. I'm here, as mentioned, with my dear friend Tal, who's an accomplished Air Force pilot in the Israeli Army, an accomplished entrepreneur in America, and an author also. His latest book is God is in the Crowd, if I'm not mistaken, right, Tal?
Yes.
Which really pertains to the topic that is on our table today, and that is the state of the Jewish nation in the next 20 years. Not that we are prophets, but we can certainly glean from the sages and from their teachings and speak about our own humble input on where the future of the state of Israel is going. Tal, thank you so much for being here all the way. I think you're in New York, right?
I'm in New York today. Thank you for inviting me.
No, thank you. And it's always a pleasure getting together, really. Tov. Okay, we'll get right to it. By the way, I'm Pinchas Allouche, the Rabbi of Congregation Bet Tefillah in Scottsdale, Arizona, and a student of Rabbi Steinsaltz until this very day. He's the inspiration also behind everything that we do here in Arizona and beyond. Okay, so we'll get right to the passage of the Talmud. I'm going to share my screen. And again, the source is Tractate Brachot 3a. We'll be using, of course, Rabbi Steinsaltz's translation and commentary of the Talmud. Here it is. All right. So this is the passage. Maybe Tal, as a Chevruta, maybe you'll read it and then we'll delve into it. Maybe you read the story. No? Said it?
Okay, absolutely. Okay. Incidental to the mention of the elevated significance of night watchers, the Gemara cites a related story. It was taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yosef said, I was once walking along the road when I entered the ruins of an old abandoned building among the ruins of Jerusalem in order to pray. I noticed that Elijah of blessed memory came and guarded the entrance for me and waited at the entrance until I finished my prayer. When I finished praying and exited the ruin, Elijah said to me deferentially, as one would address a rabbi, greetings to you, my rabbi. I answered him, greetings to you, my rabbi, my teacher. And Elijah said to me, my son, why did you enter this ruin? I said to him, in order to pray. And Elijah said to me, you should have prayed on the road. And I said to him, I was unable to pray along the road because I was afraid that I might be interrupted by travelers and would be unable to focus. Elijah said to me, you should have recited the abbreviated prayer instituted for just such circumstances.
Right. So that's the story, a very interesting story, which we'll get back to. And Rabbi Yossi concluded 3 lessons, I think, from this story. Let's just continue with this short paragraph.
Rabbi Yossi concluded, at that time, from that brief exchange, I learned from him 3 things. I learned that one may not enter a ruin, and I learned that one need not enter a building to pray, but he may pray along the road. And I learned that one who prays along the road recites an abbreviated prayer so that he may maintain his focus.
Right. Okay, so it's an interesting story. Let's just put it in a historical context. And the context, of course, is starts with Rabbi Yossi, who was a 2nd century sage. He lived shortly after the destruction of the temple, of the Second Temple. He was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was also known as moderate. His halachic opinions were very moderate, and they weren't extreme in any shape or form. And therefore, the halacha almost always follows Rabbi Yossi's opinion. But with the backdrop of this destruction of the temple that had just occurred and the Jewish nation in ruins, Rabbi Yossi enters a ruin, one of the ruins of Jerusalem. And as the commentaries explain, this is, of course, reflecting something much deeper. Rabbi Yossi, not knowing what to do with the state of the nation that is now destroyed in his times, he enters a ruin. He says to himself, well, I can't deal now with the outside world. It's too painful. So I'll enter my own ruin, my own corner, my own bubble, and I'll pray. And I hope that God will save me from this. After he finishes to pray, Elijah, the prophet, reveals himself to him, and he says, Rabbi Yossi, that's not the way to deal with ruins. Why? He says, you can't pray in a ruin. What do you have to do? Go outside. Don't get stuck in your bubble. But your task after witnessing destruction is construction, is to rebuild. So go outside. He says, but outside, I'll be distracted. There's too many passerbys or too many distractions. And Eliyahu Navi says to them, pray a shorter prayer, but your task is to be outside. Don't sink in the ruins, rather emerge from the ruins and rebuild the world outside. And if you have to compromise and pray a shorter prayer, then let it be. But that's what you need to do. And in a way, I think that story, and Tal, I want to hear what you have to say, and it's a Chevruta after all, but this story, I think, reflects well the state of the Jewish nation as it has been for the past 300 years. Because after the Napoleon's emancipation, I think the big question in the Jewish world until today is how do we deal with the world outside? The first answer is let's go into our ruins. Let's go into our own Bnei Braks and into our own Williamsburgs and Borough Parks and other cities like that. And let's focus on our spiritual work to pray. The second answer has been let's go outside, which is Eliyahu Navi's first approach. Go outside. Don't close yourself in, but open yourself up to the outside and face outwards. And there, bring your values to the outside world. Bring your prayer. Bring the voice of God to a place that might not have it yet. That was a second approach. Now, that approach, unfortunately, has two sides to it. One side is just go outside, and if you need to compromise completely, compromise completely. If you need to even eliminate that prayer or that value, then eliminate it. It might serve as a conflict, and we don't want to invite conflict in. The other side of that is no, go outside and influence the world with your values. Don't compromise them. Turn them into beacons of light for the dark world out there. And I think, if I may add, that it is specifically that latter approach of bringing our prayer to the outside that has created this winning formula. And we see, I think now after 300 years, that Jews that do not shy away from their values and rather bring those values to the outside world are the streams in Judaism that are thriving. Jews that have compromised their values are not necessarily thriving, and Jews that are inside their ruins might be thriving in their own way, but their disconnection from the world, I think, hurts them in many, many ways. So I use the story truly as a source of inspiration, and maybe that's also why these lessons at that time, Eliyahu Navi made it very clear. Rabbi Yossi learned that lesson very quickly too. You can't enter a ruin. You have to go outside and bring that prayer outside, even if you need to abbreviate that prayer. Anyway, that's the big picture. I want to hear from you, Tal, especially that you're an expert in this. Your take. Maybe you totally disagree, and maybe you see things just slightly differently or hugely differently. But let me hear you.
Well, first, Pinchas,
if that's okay, like this, I can see you better. Go for it.
First, every time we study together, you find the passages in Gemara where the fewest amount of lines say the most, and this passage is so packed. I completely agree and embrace your interpretation. I think as always there's even more. There's even more in there. So I certainly acknowledge this. This story is very much a kind of a guide to how do we organize ourselves today in that sort of two ends of the spectrum. One is being cloistered in these very segregated communities and trying not to interact with the outside world. And the second is, yes, embracing our interaction with the outside world. What the other things that I see here, which I think are very relevant to this specific point in Jewish history, is embracing dynamism, which is to me a very Jewish notion. Is we don't stand still. Judaism is in constant evolution. There are periods where I think that evolution is slower and periods where it's faster. There are kind of evolutionary periods and revolutionary periods. Right. I think the time of this story was a revolutionary period, where we went from a very geography-centric enterprise. I don't want to call it religion because I don't think that captures what Judaism was or is, today.
Right.
In its Yeah,
Rabbi Steinsaltz called it a family. He also didn't like the word religion.
I like family a lot better than religion. Yes, I think there's more to it than that, and there are obviously aspects of religion, but it doesn't tick the same boxes as Christianity or Islam, for example. It's a somewhat different enterprise, different animal. But that enterprise was fundamentally changing at exactly that period, from a geographically focused, hierarchical society to a diaspora. This is exactly the time that diaspora is starting, and the model had to evolve very quickly, right? From one where we go and pray in a specific place to one where we're really bereft of any place physically, right? There is no physical place for the Jews. We're dispersing it from Casablanca to Warsaw,
right.
And even beyond that, with no central leadership, no hierarchy, no Kohen Gadol. We only had kind of regional leadership or even local leadership. There was no leader of global Jewry for 2,000 years.
Right.
So that's
I think ever since the Sanhedrin, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that was a period where we were forced into a very rapidly evolving, almost revolutionary model. I think we're actually in one of those periods today, and I'll come back to why in a moment. But what Rabbi Yosei is proposing here is, number one, if we cling too hard to the past, we'll become irrelevant and we'll dissolve, right? So yes, you used to come to a specific place to pray. That's changing now.
Right.
Number two is, how do you change it? So the notion of an abbreviated prayer, the tamtzit, the concentrate of what we're doing, that's actually a wonderfully Jewish exercise. Is let's distill. I'm reminded of Rabbi Hillel with the Torah the Torah on one foot.
Right.
Don't do unto your neighbor that which is hateful to you. The rest is commentary. Right. That is a tamtzit. That's might be an extreme tamtzit, but forcing us to, rather than go through the complicated exercise every day, which over time you risk kind of just going through the motions. Forcing yourself to actually abbreviate means let's try to distill the essence. What's the most important that we want to carry forward of Judaism? What do we want to take from yesterday into tomorrow? Because we can't take everything, and we have to be selective because things are changing. Right. So what is the most important? And that's a key exercise. And then the third, which I think is perhaps the most controversial, is it relates very much to what you said, which is, to what extent are we interacting with the wider world?
Right.
And to me, look, Judaism really works in that form, and that's really what diaspora has been about. I think it's been our strength, is that we evolve differently in different geographies through our interaction with different host communities over the last 2,000 years. And we have distilled and taken from each of those interactions something different. I don't want to say the best or the worst of our kind of German neighbors or Polish neighbors or our Egyptian neighbors. That's probably beyond me to kind of judge what was good and what was not. But just by virtue of having that very diverse exposure, and then having to internally reconcile, okay, what do we keep from that, and what that, I think that's been a really force for positive change in Judaism over the centuries. I see no reason to stop it. And I think you're right. You're making compromises when you do that, of course.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big compromises is something that we're experiencing right now, which is the reduction in our numbers, through intermarriage and just I think general loss of interest in Judaism. So it's something I think maybe could be managed differently, but I don't think there's an alternative. We don't want to lock ourselves into gated communities.
Right. It's interesting because it's a tough exercise. Sometimes we're too good at learning from the world, in the sense that the world almost overpowers the Judaism that we try to bring to it. So there are elements in the world that certainly have enhanced Judaism, and there are many elements in Judaism that have enhanced the world too. And I think the ultimate goal is really to see them as one, not to see them as enemies, but to see them as one. As Rabbi Steinsaltz wrote in one of his early prayers, that his prayer to God is that when he sees the world, he sees the Torah, and when he sees the Torah, he sees the world. And of course, that's the ultimate bar. We have to be in the world first and foremost, to come out of our ruins to achieve that. Secondly, I think we have to bring our prayers to the world, right, in order to achieve that too. But we also have to remain open to the world, but not to the world itself and its materialism, but rather to the world and its divine messages, so to speak, right? And I think that in a way is the best way to achieve what you're speaking about. But also, I think I made a mistake. I used the word compromise, that we have to compromise. I don't think it's a question of compromising, but rather I think it's a question of readjusting, right? So from going back to that Talmudic source, when Eliyahu Hanavi, Elijah the prophet, tells Rabbi Yossi, well, then make your prayer shorter, right? You have to go outside. You can't stay in the ruins. And outside, while you're telling me you have distractions, so make your prayer shorter. I think what he may be saying, and I might be taking this too far, but maybe Elijah is saying that there are times for prayer, long prayers, focused prayers, prayers in which you fly into ecstasy. And we've had times like that in Jewish history, that says that the Hasidim Rishonim, the first Hasidim, used to spend hours in prayer. But there are times, especially times after ruins, after destructions, where there is not much time for prayer. Rather, there's time for deed. And that's what we need to focus on. And in a way, I think if we look at Jewish history, there's a lot to learn for the next 20 years. And that is that after every, it just amazes me, but after every moment or era of destruction, we've responded with a spur of growth like never before, right? So speaking of the times of Rabbi Yossi, after the destruction of the temple, the Babylonian Talmud was created. And after the Spanish Inquisition, the school of Kabbalah was founded. And some say after the Holocaust, the state of Israel is a sign of that too, right? So I think that's always been the Jewish method or the Jewish response, maybe paved by Eliyahu Hanavi right there and then. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do agree with that. Yeah, I would say, to take the same thing but zoomed out a bit is the period in which this passage is written is one where we're fundamentally changing our geographic footprint. What is the shape of world Jewry from concentrated in Eretz Israel to dispersed around the world? And we're at a period today where we're again dramatically transforming the physical shape of Judaism in the world, from diaspora to really two centers, Israel and the United States. That's where the Jews are now. The vast majority of Jews in the world. It's not an evenly spread or even close to evenly spread diaspora anymore. And that brings with it, I think, just like we went from, okay, we're not going to pray in ruins and we're going to do an abbreviated prayer. Those are adjustments to a new reality. We need, I think, adjustments to a new reality today, where we actually have Jewish sovereignty for the first time in 2,000 years.
Yeah.
We have something resembling hierarchy, which I think we need to be very careful. And I think we've been somewhat haphazard about how we've structured that.
What do you mean? Yeah, what do you mean? How?
Well, we have a global seat of Judaism for the first time today in Israel, right? And we have a government of the Jews,
right,
in a state that purports to be the nation state of the Jews, of all Jews, right? That's Israel's ambition, not to be the nation state of Israeli Jews, but to be the nation of the Jews, all Jews.
Mm-hmm.
So we've made that claim, but I think we stumbled into that claim somewhat haphazardly, right? Without really building the foundation and the mechanisms through which we would be Jewish and govern ourselves going forward. And we have a great opportunity right now because we also have incredible agency that we haven't had in the last 2,000 years, right? I mean, the Jews are in a position to, I think, define their destiny in a way that we haven't had in such a long time. And I think the formation of Israel is at the heart of that, right? And I think Israel is probably the fundamental tool that we should be using to shape, as you say, the next 20 years, or maybe the next few generations of Judaism, which, as you know, I write about. I think this is a moment of opportunity, but also a moment of challenge for us, because I think if we do nothing, we risk fading.
Yeah. So then back, if that's the case, Tal, so I know time is short also, but so to go back to the very original question, how do you see, based on everything that you said and that we studied now, how do you see the state of the Jewish nation altogether in the next 20 years? Where is it going? How is it looking?
Well, look, I'm an optimist. So, like I said, this is a moment of challenge and also a moment of opportunity. I think the key challenge that we need to face is that Judaism is absolutely an individual choice today, and that has not been the case for most Jews for the last 2,000 years.
Right.
We had a host community that didn't really allow us to be anything but Jews. Today, that's just not the case. And I think the United States is really kind of the key challenge there, is that this is a society that has fundamentally embraced the Jews. Right. And you can marry whoever you want. In fact, if you look at surveys, this is the ethnic group that's most sought after for marriage. So it's not just that we're spurned by our neighbors; we are more than welcomed by our neighbors, which is a challenge, right? We have to decide, how important is it to us to be Jewish? Should there be Jews? And that's a fundamental question that I think we have to answer. We won't answer it if we're not asking it. We need to start by asking that question.
I know it's your first question. I love that question. Should there be Jews? Right? Yeah. And if so, what are you doing about it? Right.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah. But you're optimistic that the answer will be yes, at least by many, if not most, of our nation?
I think by enough of our nation, and it's probably a longer discussion for another time, but I think we also have to talk about the strangers on the road, and to what extent, because I think the corollary of our being embraced by our neighbors is, to what extent are we embracing our neighbors? Because there's also a lot of interest among non-Jews today in being Jewish, and we see that also. There's good numbers on both of those trends today. So to what extent are we welcoming people into this enterprise that you and I agreed not to call just a religion, and maybe not even just a family, but to what extent can you marry into our family?
Right.
But that's for a longer conversation.
That's a longer discussion. I think also it has a lot to do with the word commitment, how much we committed to them and they committed to us.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Okay. No, fantastic. So just to maybe just to summarize, I would wholeheartedly agree with you. I think that's the question, and I wish people would hear you ask it. I know you ask it everywhere you go and you travel a lot, but that's the question we should ask ourselves. Should there be Jews? And if yes, what are we doing about it? I'll add to that maybe a mystical idea, and that is that the prophet has already promised, right, that Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker, that the eternity of the Jewish nation will endure on and on and on to eternity. Netzach Yisrael lo yeshaker. The big question, I think, is not whether there will be Jews in 20 years or in 100 years. The big question is whether you and I will be a part of that Jewish nation. Because God already promised that this is an eternal nation. And that's a question we have to ask ourselves. Well, do we want to be a part of it? And if yes, what are we doing about it, right? And so that's the lens in which I see the next 20 years, and for that sake, the next 100 and 1,000 years. I will just add maybe one layer, going back to Rabbi Yossi. I think it will also depend not so much on our prayer, but really on our deed. I think the way to be Jewish is not to be Jewish, but it's to do Jewish. And in that sense, I want to evoke one of the most soul-stirring responses I saw from the late Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rabbi Schneerson, who was faced with a big tragedy I think it was in 1956 or 1957, but there was a terrible terrorist attack in Kfar Chabad, a small village just outside of Ben Gurion that was beginning to emerge as the Chabad village of the state of Israel. And the terrorists had killed multiple teachers and students, and they were devastated, and some thought to even close the village. So they wrote to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe responded with a telegram that included only 3 words. And the 3 words were, Behemshech habinyan titnechamu. if you continue to build, you will find comfort. And I think in a way, that is also one of the great conditions for a thriving future of the Jewish nation. If we continue to build, if we continue to do, it's no coincidence to me that most of the mitzvot in the Torah, the 630 mitzvot, are deed-based, because that, I think, is also a very important element, and an element that will really determine where we are going as a nation. So maybe I would encourage everyone, and I don't know if you'll join my plea, Tal, but for everyone to take upon themselves a new mitzvah, and a mitzvah that's deed-based, that doesn't just enhance you being Jewish, but it enhances you doing Jewish. And that's, in my eyes, is what counts most. And this is what I think Eliyahu Navi was also telling Rabbi Yossi. Don't pray too much, but do much. Emor me'at v'aseh harbe. Say a little, do much. Yeah.
You always summarize our conversation so beautifully, Pinchas, and I join you in that plea wholeheartedly.
Okay, thank you, Tom. Thank you. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's always a pleasure. We'll continue on and on and on. And I thank everyone for joining us.